Nolan Pierce walked into Westbridge Galleria to fix a jewelry store's flickering wiring, dressed in a plain work jacket with nothing on him but a radio clipped to his belt. He was crossing the marble atrium when he heard a voice he hadn't heard in months call his name, and he turned to find his ex-wife standing beside a man in a tailored suit, a man who wore the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told no. Marissa smiled the way people smile at something they pity, and she introduced Nolan to her new husband as the maintenance man who used to fix things around their old apartment. Grant Blackwood barely looked up from his phone as he shook Nolan's hand, then launched into a story about the deal he was about to close on this very mall. Neither of them noticed the small brass plaque near the elevator bank, the one bearing the name of the company that actually owned the building. Nolan said nothing. He listened and he waited to see how far a man could sink before he realized he was already standing on the ground he despised. The atrium smelled of espresso and cut flowers from the kiosk near the escalators, and somewhere above them a string quartet was tuning for the evening's reception, the notes drifting down through the skylights like something out of a memory he had almost let himself forget. Marissa's laugh had changed since their marriage, brighter now, practiced aimed outward rather than inward the way it used to be when it was meant only for him. Grant's watch caught the light every time he gestured, a small habit that seemed designed to be seen. None of it wounded Nolan the way it might have years earlier. He filed it away the same patient way he filed every small malfunction in the building around him, waiting for the right moment to address it properly. If you want to see the moment pride finally runs out of road, stay through to the end and press subscribe so you never miss the next story. Nolan had arrived that afternoon the way he arrived most afternoons, slipping through a side entrance before the crowd thickened into shoppers and strollers and teenagers clustered near the fountain. He was not there for the reception glittering under the skylights, the one with waiters carrying champagne and a banner promising an evening of investment opportunity. He was there because a jeweler on the second floor had reported a burning smell behind her display cases, and Nolan had learned over many years that the small warnings were the ones worth answering himself. It had become a habit. Nobody questioned the owner walking his own halls in scuffed boots, checking breaker panels and drainage grates with his own hands. The staff who had worked there longest knew exactly who he was, but at his own request, they never made a show of it in front of customers. He preferred the mall to feel like a place where people did their jobs, not a stage where his presence turned heads. That anonymity had protected him for years, right up until the moment it collided with his past. Crossing the marble concourse, Nolan heard his name in a voice that used to fill their kitchen every morning. Marissa stood there in a gown clearly meant for the evening, her hand resting on the forearm of a broad-shouldered man Nolan had never met. This was his first look at Grant Blackwood, the man his daughter now mentioned in passing, the man who had married the woman Nolan once promised forever. Marissa's eyes swept over his work jacket and the radio on his belt, and her expression softened into the particular kindness people reserve for those they believe have fallen behind. She introduced him with a gentle laugh, telling Grant that Nolan was her former husband, a good man who had always been handy with tools and had apparently stayed exactly where she left him. Nolan did not correct her. He only asked Grant evenly whether he was here for business or for shopping. Grant answered with the enthusiasm of a man who loved the sound of his own plans. "Business," he said. "I'm closing on this mall. The current ownership is bleeding out, and soon enough they'll have no choice but to take my offer." Marissa added almost proudly that if the deal went through, Grant intended to transform the whole place. Grant looked around the atrium the way a man looks at a house he has already decided to gut. "Whoever owns this building has no vision," he said. "None." "Have you ever actually met the owner?" Nolan asked. Grant laughed and waved a hand as if swatting away something small. "Men who own buildings like this only care about the numbers on a page, nothing more." Before he steered Marissa toward the reception hall, Grant promised that by noon the next day, whoever held the deed would have no choice but to accept his terms. He pressed a business card into Nolan's palm without quite realizing he was doing it. Nolan looked down at it and understood with a strange and quiet calm that the man had just described him to his face without knowing it. The story of how Nolan came to stand in that atrium began years earlier, back when Westbridge Galleria was dying by inches and nobody in Marissa's circle believed it was worth saving. In those years, Nolan worked as the facilities manager, the man who kept the failing air conditioning running and coaxed one more season out of an aging boiler while storefronts around him went dark one by one. Marissa never understood why he poured so much of himself into a place that seemed destined to close, watching him come home late, his shirt smelling of dust and machine oil, with no clear path upward that she could see. In her eyes, he had become a man without ambition, content to patch a sinking ship instead of finding solid ground. Nolan carried some of the blame for the distance that grew between them, because he rarely explained the plans forming quietly in his mind. He spent his evenings studying lease structures and cash flow statements that were not his to study, mapping the mall's hidden potential in notebooks he never showed her. Marissa wanted the certainty of a stable life, something she could hold and plan around, while Nolan offered her only the shape of a future he had not yet built. The gap between what she needed and what he could promise widened until neither of them could bridge it, and the marriage ended quietly, without cruelty but without rescue either. He still remembered the particular quiet of their last months, the way conversations at the dinner table thinned into logistics and silence, the way Marissa started leaving lights on in rooms she wasn't in, as though she could not stand an empty house any more than she could stand an uncertain one. He remembered standing in the mall's dim parking garage late one night, phone in hand, trying to find the words to explain a plan that still lived only in his head, and hanging up without saying any of it. He had told himself back then that actions would speak louder than explanations, that if he simply built something worth trusting, trust would follow. It was a young man's mistake, the kind made by people who confuse patience with communication, and he had paid for it in the currency of a marriage he still, on quiet nights, wished he had fought harder to save. After Marissa left, the mall's original owner filed for bankruptcy within the year. Instead of hunting for a new job, Nolan did something almost nobody expected. He convinced a small group of investors, including a sharp and skeptical woman named Evelyn Sterling, to buy the failing property at a price low enough to look foolish to anyone who had not studied it the way he had. He emptied his savings, took a loan against the small house he still lived in, and accepted a controlling share of stock in place of most of his salary, betting everything on a building most people had already written off. Over the following years, he rebuilt Westbridge Galleria piece by piece, renegotiating leases, preserving the local shops that gave the place its character, and modernizing the systems he once repaired by hand. As the other early investors grew impatient and sold their shares, Nolan quietly bought them back one transaction at a time, until he held a majority stake in the holding company that controlled the property. Today, he owned 61% of Harborline Retail Group, which meant that every lease, every renovation, every decision about this mall ultimately passed through him. Evelyn, the investor who had bet on him when almost no one else would like to say that Nolan had bought the mall with money and rebuilt it with patience. Two things most people never learn to spend wisely at the same time. She had watched him turn down offers to sell his shares for a quick profit more than once, choosing instead to keep reinvesting in the very tenants everyone assumed were worthless, and over time, that stubbornness had proven her right. Even so, Nolan never changed the way he lived. He avoided interviews, kept no portrait of himself in any office, and went on walking the halls in work boots long after he no longer needed to fix anything himself. Marissa only ever knew in the vaguest terms that he had gone to work for some kind of investment company after their divorce, and because their conversation since had revolved almost entirely around their daughter Paige, she had never once asked what that meant. Back in the present, a message from Tessa Rowe buzzed against Nolan's hip as he stood near the elevators. Blackwood Urban Holdings had just requested an emergency presentation before the board that evening. Grant, it seemed, was not interested in a partnership. He wanted full control of the mall, and he wanted it fast. Nolan typed back that the presentation should proceed exactly as scheduled, but asked Tessa to keep his identity as controlling owner out of any conversation with Grant or Marissa for now. He wanted to see, without the weight of his name hanging over the room, exactly what kind of man Grant became when he believed no one powerful was watching. The trouble at the jewelry store turned out to be a scorched outlet behind a display case, the air around it sharp with the smell of overheated wire. While the maintenance team made their way up from the lower level, Nolan found the correct breaker himself and cut power to the affected circuit before it could spread his movements, quick and practiced. The store owner, a woman named Diane who had leased the same corner for nearly 2 decades, pressed a hand to her chest and thanked him twice, calling him by name in a way that made Grant's brow furrow, though he said nothing of it. Nolan crouched beside the outlet, running his fingers along the blackened plastic, already calculating which section of the aging wiring would need to be prioritized in next quarter's budget. It was the kind of small, unglamorous decision that never appeared in any glossy investment proposal, the kind only a person who actually cared about the building would ever bother making. Grant had been standing nearby with Marissa watching, and he mistook Nolan's quiet authority over the arriving technicians for the confidence of an experienced repairman. He used the moment as a lesson for his wife. That's the difference, he said, between people who fix problems and people who own buildings. One kind spends a life solving small emergencies for somebody else's benefit. The other kind makes the decisions that matter. Nolan heard every word and let the silence stand. Once the outlet was secured, Grant returned to his renovation plans with even more enthusiasm than before, explaining that he intended to demolish the entire West Wing home to a cluster of family-run shops and replace it with a corridor of luxury fashion brands. "And the tenants leasing that space?" Nolan asked. "What happens to them?" "Business isn't charity," Grant said without hesitation. "Any shop that can't generate enough profit makes way for someone willing to pay more." Marissa felt a flicker of discomfort at the coldness in his voice, though she still found herself defending him, telling Nolan that Grant was only doing what was necessary to elevate the property. Grant turned to Nolan then, half mocking. "Ever think about doing something more with your life than fixing wiring for other people? Sometimes the person who understands a building most intimately is exactly the person best suited to own it," Nolan said. Grant laughed, short and dismissive. Men who repair buildings rarely end up owning them. At that moment, Tessa approached, nearly greeting him as Mr. Pierce, before catching herself telling him instead that the attorney and the board were waiting. Nolan redirected smoothly, asking her to double-check a maintenance report, and Grant, misreading the whole exchange, assumed Tessa was Nolan's supervisor and even suggested she let him leave early to change into something appropriate for the reception. Tessa kept her composure and agreed to follow Nolan's instructions, then slipped him a folder as she turned to go. Across its cover, in plain black letters, were the words reserved strictly for the owner's copy of the acquisition proposal. Marissa caught the phrase just before Nolan tucked the folder beneath his arm, and she said nothing, filing the detail away with the others that had begun to accumulate. Nolan met Tessa and the mall's attorney, Avery Sloan, in a private office behind the service corridor, far from the noise being assembled upstairs. Avery laid out the irregularities buried inside Blackwood's proposal with the precision of someone who had spent decades reading contracts for exactly this kind of deception. Grant's paperwork claimed the mall's occupancy rate sat at only 68%, when the true figure verified independently stood closer to 91%. By understating the property's value on paper, Grant hoped to pressure the board into accepting an offer worth nearly 40% less than the mall was actually worth. Worse, his team had quietly approached several major retailers, encouraging them to delay their lease renewals, then used that hesitation as proof the mall was losing tenants. His redevelopment plan called for shutting down the entire West Wing within 18 months, terminating leases for 42 small businesses that had operated there for years. If the deal collapsed the way Grant had engineered it, hundreds of employees stood to lose their livelihoods without warning. Tessa wanted Nolan to reject the proposal outright before it went any further. Nolan disagreed. "Let him present," he said, "in front of the board and the investors. Let his own words become the evidence." Avery agreed with the strategy, pointing out that if Grant relied on his falsified numbers in front of witnesses, Nolan would have clear grounds to end every negotiation and warn off any financial partner considering the deal. Tessa leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed, still frustrated that Nolan intended to let Grant dig his own hole in full view of everyone rather than shut the door now. She had worked beside Nolan long enough to know his patience was not weakness, but the deliberate stillness of a man waiting for the right moment to close a valve rather than wrestle with a flood. Still, she worried what the delay might cost him, watching him absorb insult after insult with a composure she was not certain she could have managed. Nolan caught the look on her face and offered a small, tired smile. "Letting him talk isn't the same as letting him win," he said, and he made clear that his decision had nothing to do with Marissa or the sting of being underestimated in front of her. Grant's contempt was a personal matter, small and forgettable. A plan built to harm hundreds of working families was something else entirely, and that was the reason he intended to act. Grant himself walked into the service office moments later looking for a maintenance worker to join a pre-presentation inspection. He wanted someone who understood the building's systems firsthand to help him argue that the infrastructure was outdated and desperate for investment. Seeing Nolan standing there, he decided he had found exactly the right man. Certain Nolan would make the perfect witness to a story about a mall in need of rescue. Nolan accepted without hesitation. Avery quietly asked whether he was sure about walking into that role, and Nolan answered that Grant wanted the person who understood this building better than anyone else at his side, and he intended to give him precisely that. Grant led the small group through the mall himself, gesturing towards section after section he planned to tear down, describing the local shops as relics of a bygone era that wealthy shoppers no longer wished to see. Nolan asked short, pointed questions about renovation costs, energy consumption, foot traffic, and projected timelines for return. Grant never answered directly, deferring each question to an assistant trailing behind him while he painted his vision in broad, glowing strokes. Marissa began to notice, almost against her will, that Nolan did not speak like an ordinary maintenance worker. He understood the value of individual sections of the property, the revenue generated by each floor, even the specific lease terms governing several of the larger anchor stores. When the group reached the West Wing, a shop owner stepped out to greet Nolan with unmistakable warmth. He was a soft-spoken man named Walter, who sold hand-repaired watches and clocks behind a scarred wooden counter, and Nolan asked about his business by name, recalling without hesitation the exact date his lease was due for renewal. "Slow through the winter," Walter admitted, "but picking back up now that the weather's turned." Nolan asked whether his grandson had started his apprenticeship at the shop yet, the way they'd discussed months earlier, and Walter's face brightened in a way that had nothing to do with money or leases at all. Grant assumed without much thought that Nolan was simply friendly with the tenants after years of fixing things for them. A brief power flicker interrupted the corridor lighting soon after, and Grant seized on it as proof the building was failing. Nolan checked the nearby panel and found that the outage had nothing to do with the mall's electrical grid and everything to do with a testing device from Grant's own survey team plugged carelessly into the wrong outlet. He restored power within minutes without embarrassing anyone. Grant took credit anyway, telling the group his team had just helped uncover a serious structural issue. Marissa watched the whole exchange and felt the first real pull of discomfort settle into her chest, an unease she could not yet name. Near the end of the walkthrough, Nolan glimpsed a renovation map Grant had left open on a table when he clearly hadn't meant to leave in plain sight. The entire West Wing was marked in red ink, with a note instructing that all 42 leases be terminated immediately upon takeover. It directly contradicted what Grant had promised the board only days earlier when he swore every current tenant would be protected. With Tessa's quiet consent, since the document had already been formally submitted as part of Blackwood's survey materials, Nolan photographed the map before returning it to the table. When he handed the folder back, Marissa caught a clear, unmistakable glimpse of the words printed across its cover, identifying it as the owner's copy. This time there was no explaining it away as coincidence. She found Nolan later in a quiet hallway tucked away from the crowd, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. She had spent the better part of an hour turning the small details over in her mind. The folder, the way the staff deferred to him, the ease with which he spoke about lease terms. Most maintenance workers would never think to memorize until the pieces assembled into a question she could no longer avoid. "Why would a general manager hand you a folder meant strictly for the owner?" she asked, her voice low. Nolan didn't answer directly. "Why do you still assume I'm the same man you left all those years ago?" She admitted he had never once told her about any changes in his life since the divorce, and Nolan reminded her gently that their conversations after the split had narrowed almost entirely to logistics involving Paige. She confessed she had introduced him poorly to Grant, though she still assumed he had simply been promoted into some management or consulting role. Nolan chose not to correct that assumption yet. "You introduced me according to what you believed," he said, "not what you actually knew." The conversation drifted almost inevitably back toward the real reason their marriage had ended. Nolan admitted he had stayed silent too often in those years, trusting that hard work alone would eventually make itself understood without explanation. Marissa admitted in turn that she had been consumed by a fear of poverty and had become fixated on the idea that only a visibly successful husband could keep that fear at bay. Grant appeared before the conversation could go further, visibly irritated to find his wife alone with her former husband. Nolan showed him the termination map without preamble. "Why does this contradict the promises you made the board this morning?" "It's a contingency plan," Grant said quickly, then sharpened, "and you should stop overstepping a position that isn't yours to question. Will you tell the board the truth during your presentation?" The board only needs to hear whatever gets the deal approved. Later, Grant instructed an assistant to dig into Nolan's background, but the search returned little of substance, only confirming that he had once served as facilities manager before moving on to Harbor Line Retail Group. Because the company's ownership ran through several layered holding entities, the assistant couldn't determine Nolan's actual role, and Grant concluded with total confidence that Nolan was simply a long-time employee trying to appear more important than he was. He decided to use Nolan that evening as a prop, a visual example of the working man who would supposedly benefit once the deal closed, and even prepared an offer to promote Nolan to head of maintenance in front of the entire room, believing the gesture would look generous, while quietly reminding Nolan of his place. Around the same time, Avery informed Nolan that an investment bank had already begun drafting a loan agreement based entirely on Grant's falsified figures. What had started as one man's private arrogance was becoming a real transaction with real consequences, and if Nolan did nothing tonight, Grant's lie stood a real chance of becoming permanent fact. The reception filled the atrium with soft light, and the low hum of conversation board members and bank representatives and shop owners mingling beneath the skylights, while a small stage waited near the fountain. Grant stood at its center with Marissa beside him, playing the supportive wife to a man about to close the biggest deal of his career. Nolan remained near the back with Tessa and Avery, unremarkable in the simple suit he always wore. Grant began his presentation with the same distorted figures Avery had already flagged, describing the mall as a fading asset only Blackwood Urban Holdings had the vision to save. Partway through, he called Nolan onto the stage without warning, introducing him to the room as a hard-working single father who had spent years fixing the building, but never once had a real chance to rise. Marissa's stomach tightened as she realized Grant intended to use Nolan as a prop, and she murmured for him to stop, but Grant continued. In front of hundreds of guests, he offered Nolan the position of head of maintenance, once the acquisition closed, framing the salary as the kind of stability a man in his position could only dream of. Nolan thanked him and declined. Grant, mistaking the refusal for embarrassment, pressed harder. "Can a man in your circumstances really afford to turn down an opportunity like this?" Nolan asked one quiet question of his own. "Are you sure you want to continue your presentation using the numbers currently on that screen? You should learn to recognize your own limitations," Grant said coldly. Just as the tension threatened to spill over Evelyn, Sterling rose from her seat and made her way toward the stage. Assuming she was the mall's true owner, Grant brightened and invited her up to say a few words in support of the acquisition. Evelyn did not take the microphone. She turned to Nolan instead and told the room plainly that the decision belonged to him because he was the controlling shareholder and true owner of the mall. Silence dropped over the atrium like a curtain. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass clinked against a tray, and then went still as though even the waitstaff understood something irreversible had just happened. Marissa looked at Nolan, then at Grant, watching her husband's face slide into confusion, his jaw tightening the way it always did right before he lost an argument. On the screen behind them, Avery displayed the ownership structure of Harbor Line Retail Group, confirming that Nolan Pierce held 61% of the company and final authority over every decision concerning the mall. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some guests reaching for their phones, others simply staring at the two men on stage as though watching a trick they couldn't explain. The man Grant had just offered a maintenance job was the very person he had come here to buy out from under. Nolan did not mock him and did not bring up the marriage that once connected them. He stepped to the microphone himself. "Before anyone signs anything," he said to the room, "you should see what's actually in this proposal." He asked Avery to walk the investors through the discrepancies one by one in plain, measured language, and he narrated the parts that mattered most himself. The true occupancy figures, the real revenue, the actual lease agreements, and the hidden plan to shutter the West Wing appeared on the screen in sequence, and the investors began to understand exactly how badly Grant had misrepresented the mall's value. Nolan revealed the termination map showing 42 shops set to lose their leases, directly contradicting the promise Grant had made only days earlier. A representative from the financing bank stood and announced that the loan agreement would be suspended pending review. Grant tried to push back, claiming Nolan had turned an ordinary negotiation into a personal act of revenge because of Marissa. "I knew you were her husband before your presentation began," Nolan answered, "and I still gave you a fair chance to make your case honestly. What ended this deal was never your insult. It was your plan to deceive an entire board and put hundreds of people out of work without warning." He rejected the Blackwood Urban Holdings proposal on the spot, and in its place announced that he would reinvest in the West Wing himself, restoring the property without terminating a single lease held by a business in good standing. Marissa stood frozen at the edge of the stage, realizing that Nolan was not only wealthier than she had imagined, but had quietly become the very kind of leader Grant had only pretended to be. Grant's hands trembled at his sides as he fought to keep his voice level, the polished confidence that had carried him all evening, now cracking at the edges. Furious but composed, he accused Nolan of hiding his identity solely to humiliate him in public. "I didn't hide anything to test you," Nolan said plainly. "I've never believed a man needs to know I own a building before I decide to treat him with basic respect." The words settled over the room, quiet and unanswerable, and for a moment nobody spoke at all. Before he left the stage, Grant warned that he would make certain every investor in the room learned exactly how Nolan had really acquired the mall in the first place. And Nolan understood, even as applause began to rise around him, that tonight's reversal was far from the final word. By morning, several articles had appeared online accusing Nolan of exploiting the mall's earlier bankruptcy to seize control of the property for far less than it was worth. Grant went further, claiming publicly that Harborline Retail Group had once endangered the savings of small investors and pension funds during the acquisition. The accusations were not entirely accurate, but they carried enough weight to unsettle several board members, and an emergency meeting was called to address the growing concern among major tenants. Reading the headlines over coffee that morning, Nolan felt the old pull to defend himself loudly, to call every reporter and correct them line by line. He set the feeling aside, the way he set aside most impulses that promised satisfaction and delivered nothing useful, reminding himself that a man who had spent years building quietly did not need to start shouting now just because someone had finally noticed him. He did not answer with attacks of his own. Instead, he requested an independent audit of the entire acquisition, inviting anyone with doubts to examine the records for themselves. The results showed clearly that the mall had already been headed for closure before Nolan stepped in, and that his plan had not cost investors money, but had actually helped them recover the majority of their original stake while preserving hundreds of jobs. Marissa discovered the rest almost by accident, glancing at Grant's laptop while he stepped out to take a call, the email thread still open on the screen. She read it twice before she let herself believe it. Grant had instructed his communications team to alter the timeline in the documents sent to reporters, shifting dates to make his version of events appear more favorable. When she confronted him, he insisted it was nothing more than a necessary strategy, a normal part of managing public perception. He even asked her to publicly confirm that Nolan had once been financially irresponsible during their marriage, a claim she knew was untrue. Marissa refused. Instead, she handed Avery copies of the emails Grant had sent his communications team, proving beyond doubt that he had known the information he released to the press was false. She was not doing it to win Nolan back, nor out of any lingering affection for the life they once shared. She acted because she finally understood that staying silent any longer would make her complicit in a lie she no longer believed. At the board meeting that followed, held in a conference room overlooking the parking structure where morning light spilled across a long table of untouched coffee cups, the independent audit confirmed that Nolan had rescued the mall from closure years earlier, exactly as the records showed. Board members who had wavered under the pressure of the headlines now sat quietly, some visibly relieved, others reading the auditor's findings a second time to be sure they had understood. The bank formally withdrew its financing offer from Blackwood Urban Holdings, and Grant's own company launched an internal investigation into his conduct. He was ultimately removed from the position overseeing the project, his reputation damaged not because Nolan owned the mall, but because of the way he had chosen to pursue it. Nolan held no celebration and gave no victory interviews. He simply returned to Westbridge Galleria and resumed walking through the West Wing, checking on the very shops Grant had once planned to erase. A few days later, Marissa found him alone at a small coffee shop inside the mall, the late afternoon light falling through the skylights. She apologized for the way she had introduced him to Grant, admitting that for years she had told the story of their divorce as one where Nolan simply lacked ambition because that version made her own decision to leave easier to carry. Nolan accepted her apology without offering false hope about rekindling anything. The coffee between them had long gone cold, forgotten in the quiet, and outside the window a light rain had begun to streak the glass, blurring the shoppers hurrying past into soft smears of color. "We both made mistakes a long time ago," he told her. "I failed to share the dreams that were quietly forming inside me. And you decided my worth before those dreams ever had a chance to take shape. Marissa admitted she needed time to think about her marriage to Grant, and Nolan did not push her one way or the other, asking only that any decisions involving their daughter be made calmly without dragging Paige into conflicts that belonged entirely to the adults around her. In the months that followed, the West Wing was fully restored without a single longtime shop losing its lease exactly as Nolan had promised. Walter stood near the front with a pair of scissors waiting to cut a ribbon strung across his newly refreshed storefront, and Diane from the jewelry store had brought a tray of pastries to share with anyone who stopped by, insisting it was the least she could do after everything the West Wing had been through. Nolan attended the small reopening, but stood near the back, letting the shop owners take the center of the moment instead of himself. Paige arrived a few minutes late, teasing her father that he still wore the same old work jacket despite owning the entire building around them. "The jacket still works fine," he told her. "No reason to replace it." In the story's final moment, Nolan crossed the same marble atrium where Grant had once humiliated him in front of a crowded room, greeted now by employees who nodded to him with quiet respect rather than deference. He still stopped to help a technician wrestling with a jammed door hinge along the way, because some habits built over years of hard work never really leave. He understood standing there in the fading afternoon light that the greatest victory was never Marissa learning the truth about his wealth or Grant losing face in front of investors and reporters. The real victory was that Nolan no longer needed either of their approval to know exactly who he was. Westbridge Galleria had belonged to him on paper for years before that encounter in the atrium. But it was only after that chance meeting that he finally understood his life had always belonged entirely to himself. Outside, the evening light slanted gold across the parking lot, and Nolan lingered by the entrance a moment longer than he needed to, watching families drift in and out through the automatic doors. Watching a young father balance a toddler on one hip while fishing for his car keys with the other hand. It was such an ordinary sight, the kind he had walked past 1,000 times, and yet tonight it settled into him with unexpected weight. He thought of all the years he had spent building something patiently without ever needing anyone to notice. And he thought of Paige waiting for him now at a small table inside with 2 cups of hot chocolate already going lukewarm. Whatever Marissa decided about her marriage, whatever Grant's future held, none of it belonged to Nolan anymore. He had spent so long being defined by what other people believed about him that it took losing nothing at all to finally understand what he had never actually lost in the first place. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so the next one finds you when it's ready.